He happens to be a gentleman, Ralph, and that seems to be something that you have forgotten all about. He treats us like women. That's something you've forgotten too, Ralph. You seem to have forgotten that I am a woman.
How could I? You're always yapping.
What if a single unscripted moment ended one of television's most legendary comedies overnight? The Honeymooners redefined sitcoms with its raw, working-class humor, but behind the laughter was a moment so unsettling, it was buried for decades. One line, delivered differently than ever before, silenced the audience and sent shockwaves through the network. This is the story they try to hide, a collision of political blacklists, sponsor panic, and a live broadcast that crossed an invisible line. Was it a mistake, or the night Jackie Gleason revealed more than Ralph Kramden could handle? Jackie Gleason's story didn't start under bright studio lights or in the comfort of a Hollywood mansion. It began in a cramped Brooklyn apartment, the kind where every creak of the floorboards carried the weight of struggle. Born in 1916, Gleason was raised in an Irish-American neighborhood that was as tough as the sidewalks he walked every day. His father abandoned the family when Jackie was just 9 years old, leaving his mother to hold things together with low-paying jobs and long hours. That kind of loss shapes you. For Gleason, it created a deep well of frustration, ambition, and grit that would later pour directly into the character of Ralph Kramden. Gleason didn't have the luxury of a clear path into show business. He spent much of his youth hustling, pool halls, odd jobs, and whatever it took to bring a little money. The neighborhood itself was a theater of raw personalities, loud arguments spilling out of tenement windows, neighbors who lived paycheck to paycheck, and people whose dreams were always a little bigger than their means. These were the voices, the mannerisms, and the emotional rhythms he would eventually channel on live television. When Gleason yelled as Ralph Kramden, it wasn't just acting, it was Brooklyn coming back to life in front of the cameras. A variety stage was the board for his real big break, and not a sitcom. Gleason, with his natural charm and timing, held an almost magical appeal for audiences. By the early 1950s, he had his own television show on the Dumont Network called Cavalcade of Stars. In 1951, Ralph Kramden was introduced to the world. The character was not meant to be the refined version we envision today, but instead portrayed as crude, loud, impatient, and always plotting. Television audiences used to seeing the cardigans and sage wisdom of the TV fathers all of a sudden found themselves watching a man shouting across a tiny apartment to an equally sharp-tongued wife. That was electric. While most television at the time romanticized suburban life, the Honeymooners sketches on Cavalcade spoke with a voice that embraced the grit. Ralph was a bus driver in New York City who never seemed to catch a break. He did not own a house in the suburbs, did not have a tidy lawn, and did not have a picture-perfect family. Instead, he counted endless schemes about getting rich quickly that ended up collapsing into comic disaster. And audiences loved it. They identified with Ralph in small victories and big failures. The other element that adds to the verisimilitude is Ralph and Alice Kramden's relationship. Alice was not the docile, smiling wife seen in all other shows. She gave as good as she got. She debated Ralph, pushed back against his bluster, and chastised him when his dreams got a tad too lofty. This wasn't some sitcom fantasy. It was an argument and makeup routine that very likely resembled kitchen argumentations across America. It wasn't easy casting Alice, though. Audrey Meadows almost lost the part completely. But CBS executives thought she was too glamorous and didn't imagine her being able to act like a working-class or middle-class housewife. Meadows, however, made it her ambition to prove them wrong, put on fresh no makeup, unstarry clothes, hair pulled back. She would appear precisely like Alice to make the present case, and Gleason instantly would see her as perfect for the role. Alice was not always played by Meadows, as many would probably know. Pert Kelton, originally, was the first woman to put herself in being, yet she tends to adopt a sharper, more combative style. Then, she was replaced out of the blue with some official claims about health issues. The actual reason was murkier and loads more political. During the high tide of the Red Scare, allegations about her husband's communist ties made her a risk the network would not take. So she went without fanfare, without public announcement. Gleason's rise wasn't just about laughs. Political forces would soon alter the Honeymooners in ways no script could predict. When the Honeymooners began to catch on, it was thanks in no small part to the chemistry between Ralph and Alice Kramden. In the early sketches on Cavalcade of Stars, that chemistry was defined by Pert Kelton, the original Alice. Kelton wasn't just a straight man to Gleason's over-the-top Ralph. She had a sharp tongue, a quick wit, and a way of looking Ralph up and down that could cut him to size without a single word. She brought a rawness to the role that matched the rough edges of the early episodes. To the public, Kelton's sudden disappearance was a shock. The official statement cited health reasons, a polite and vague explanation that was almost standard in the 1950s when networks wanted to avoid scandal. But those who worked on the show knew the real story. The Red Scare, the nationwide hunt for alleged communist sympathizers, was at its peak. Entertainment was one of the industries hit hardest by the so-called blacklist. Studios, networks, and advertisers didn't just avoid hiring suspected communists, they distanced themselves from anyone even loosely connected to the accused. He was being investigated for possible ties to communist elements. In that atmosphere of fear and suspicion that hovered over both Hollywood and New York television, it had become untouchable. She was never formally charged. There was no evidence or proof of wrongdoing. But in an age when any whiff of association could sink a career in hours, CBS quietly pushed her out, calculating it way more convenient to do so without fanfare. She was tough to replace. Alice was never ever a minor character. She was the one person who could stand up to Ralph Cramden. Too soft, and the whole thing loses its zing. Too hard, and it sits all wrong with an audience looking for laughs, not domestic strife. The actress had to kind of create the character of the long-suffering spouse without making her too much of a pushover. Audrey Meadows was not the obvious choice, however. CBS executives dismissed her as too glamorous for the part during her audition. Meadows was well aware of what they meant, though. She would prove them wrong. She would show up for the audition in a brand new set of headshots that were the opposite of Hollywood sparkle. Plain dress, hair unstyled, no makeup. In those photographs, Meadows didn't look like a movie star. She looked like a working-class wife in Brooklyn who spent her days stretching every dollar. Jackie Gleason saw the photos and knew instantly she was the right fit. The minute Meadows got under the skin of the character, the chemistry altered in a big way. Alice Kelton had been loud and brash, always quick to match Ralph's energy and volume. Alice Meadows, however, was more grounded. Her sharp wit was still there, but with a calm, measured tone which made Ralph's bluster seem even bigger. Rather than yelling back, she let Ralph's anger burn itself out before subjecting him to the line that would leave him badly shaken. It gave the show a different rhythm, one that balanced the intensity of Gleason with an underlying strength of quiet. Some long-time followers of the early sketches missed Kelton's fire, but Meadows' interpretation warmed Alice so that it widened her audience. Now, the audience saw not two always vying partners, but a couple that cared for one another, despite the disagreements. The onset of hostility was punctuated by periods of sentimental tokens. "Baby, You're the Greatest" hit differently when it came after Meadows' Alice had spent an episode putting up with Ralph's wildest schemes. The political purge had reshaped the cast, but the real revolution was yet to come when the show itself changed television history. When the Honeymooners spun off into its own series in 1955, television was a very different place. The airwaves were filled with pristine living rooms, neatly dressed parents, and smiling children who learned a moral lesson by the end of each episode. Shows like Father Knows Best and Leave It to Beaver presented an idealized America, clean lawns, tidy homes, and fathers who always had the perfect advice. That was what television was supposed to be: reassuring, orderly, and above all, safe.